Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? It's all right? Great, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to thank the conference organizers, Matilda, Rachel, and Brittany, who's disappeared, there she is, for organizing such a wonderful event. So I'm just going to launch straight in. In 2015, in the Home Economics Archives at Cornell University, I came across this cache of photos from the late 1940s showing an elderly disabled homemaker going about a series of ordinary household tasks. These images immediately intrigued me. They were clearly part of a larger study, but of what kind and to what end? While I still haven't been able to identify these particular images, I now know they're not unique. In fact, studies of disabled homemakers were being consistently pursued in home economics departments across America by the 1950s. And though I'm focusing today on the US, just because that's the case study I know best, it's important to stress that studies like these were happening across the world. They were happening in the UK, Scandinavia, India, Pakistan, and beyond. I'll admit, learning about the home economists' contributions to early disability design has forced me to rethink some of the deep prejudices I have against them. Prejudices inherited from reading seminal feminist histories such as Dolores Hayden's The Grand Domestic Revolution of 1982, which fiercely denounced home economists as ideologues of the anti-feminist, pro-consumption suburban home. As my own research unfolded, however, I realized there's an important distinction to be made between the pro-consumer home economists like Christine Frederick, who famously coined the term Mrs. Consumer, and the home economists behind the disability studies, who were working in a different tradition, certainly in the US. Based in American land-grant universities, and land-grant universities were state-funded universities dedicated to applied technical subjects rather than to the liberal arts. This group had a mandate to improve the home lives of local, mostly low-income rural communities through direct engagement. To this end, at the time of these photos, Cornell's College of Home Economics had a dedicated department of housing and design, in which 7 all-female staff members taught courses to students and local people on everything from carpentry to furniture repair to farmhouse planning. Over many decades, these staff would develop a distinct mode of design practice characterized by outreach, cooperation, skills sharing, and a customized, body-centered approach. The recognition that university-based home economists nurtured a distinct design practice widens the implications of this research, stretching the discussion of domestic modernism in a way that I hope is pertinent to this conference. Most architectural history still tends to relate significant developments in post-war modernism back to European-inspired progressive architecture, or to research projects like the case study program. So the specific interest in flexible domestic design in America, represented by a move to open planning, is typically linked back to just a handful of modernist architects. Charles and Ray Eames, sitting here in their case study house, loom large. And their desire to adapt wartime technologies, materials, and methods to civilian use and a West Coast indoor-outdoor lifestyle. The history of university-based home economists suggests that a parallel but equally legitimate genealogy for the post-war interest in flexible design can be drawn. One that emerges from a female-led design culture and a concern for the domestic realm, and has female bodies of all abilities and all ages at its core. Working alongside medics, occupational therapists, and public health organizations, university-based home economists shaped an alternative vision of flexible design between the 1940s and 1960s, one that had rehabilitation as its goal and was built around an ethos of independence, adaptation, and tinkering. In this talk, I'll trace this vision as it developed through two specific projects: the Hart Kitchen of 1948 and the Homemaking for the Handicapped project of the late 1950s. So this interest in rehabilitation first emerged in the wake of World War II, when the American government began funding programs to train disabled civilian men and women to re-enter the workplace. It's significant that the home was explicitly treated as a workplace for women, just as factories or mines were treated as workplaces for men. As we'll discuss, the rehabilitationist view of domestic labor is not without its problems. But as a historian of domesticity, I'm interested in how these programs openly challenged the glamorized notions of housekeeping then in broad circulation. The rehabilitationists insisted on the unglamorous reality of female domestic labor at a time when it was being widely promised that technology and mass market products would liberate women from the domestic burden. This was, after all, the age of the miracle kitchen, or what historian Ruth Oldenziel calls the Techno Kitchen, where women were regularly assured that the chores they didn't like to do would soon be done by automated gadgets, transforming them from drudges into white-collar, push-button operators. And this quote, I think, really captures that idea. In this kitchen, the dishes are scraped, washed, and dried electronically. They even put themselves away. If only. Even the floor is cleaned electronically. So welcome to this wonderful new world of push-button cooking, cleaning, and homemaking. In sharp contrast, rehabilitationists continued to speak of domestic work as work, essential and sometimes demanding labor, without which they claimed the material and social well-being of the household, community, and nation would suffer. The most influential training program, the Disabled Homemakers Research Project, was launched in 1948 at the Institute of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at New York University. It was led by Howard A. Rusk, a medical doctor who stressed the importance of treating not only the wounded military veteran, but also the impaired civilian, what Rusk called the forgotten casualty. Rusk's approach to rehabilitating the disabled female homemaker was directly inspired by another pioneer, the influential home engineer Lillian Gilbreth. One of the showpieces of Rusk's new institute was a kitchen that Gilbreth had designed in conjunction with the New York Heart Association for female cardiac patients. This was the Hart Kitchen, and you see here there's a very literal play on this idea of the kitchen as the heart of the home. At this point, in her 70s, Gilbreth brought 5 decades of thinking about efficiency, domesticity, and disability to the Hart Kitchen. Her career had begun in the early 1900s when, in partnership with her husband Frank, Lillian conducted influential time and motion studies in the workplace that sought to enhance productivity and reduce fatigue by promoting the one best way of doing a task. Famously, the couple also applied their management techniques to their own household, as chronicled in the best-selling memoir, Cheaper by the Dozen, written by 2 of their 12 children and turned into several popular and quite awful Hollywood movies. After her death in 1924, Lillian, now shut out from more lucrative industrial contracts, began writing about the gospel of efficiency in the domestic context instead, publishing the well-known The Homemaker and Her Job in 1928. The following year, she created the Kitchen Practical, a model kitchen workspace in which she applied the concept of the work triangle, which dictated that the triangle between the stove, sink, and fridge would be no greater than 26 feet to save trips and energy. In many ways, Gilbreth's Hart Kitchen of 1948 seems a very straightforward continuation of the efficiency paradigm, though now its energy-saving features were recast as a preventative device. And it's interesting, they almost begin to speak of the kitchen itself as a kind of prosthetic device. Frustratingly, we don't have an image or view of the full Hart Kitchen, but the partial views that we have in this booklet publicizing the project show that Gilbreth here deployed many well-established features of earlier rational kitchen designs, from Catherine Beecher's 1969 galley kitchen to the Frankfurt kitchen, 1929, to Gilbreth's own Kitchen Practical. In the Hart Kitchen, for instance, we see our heroine, Catherine Landis, told to take it easy because of a weak heart, using a task chair for seated work. And the task chair was very much a staple feature of energy-saving design. We see it also in the Frankfurt kitchen. Moreover, we see that the Hart Kitchen adhered to the basic principles underlying rational kitchen design. It was assumed that there was still one best way to do domestic tasks that could be uncovered by research. To this end, a typical home engineering study always involved trip charts, such as the ones you see here, which recorded the number of trips taken to prepare an average meal, and then sought to reduce them by reorganizing the relationship between key work areas and equipment. So the main idea here was to group activities into zones or centers and to ensure that essential equipment was located at the related center to minimize needless trips. As we might expect, the Hart Kitchen involved many such studies. For example, the trip chart on the bottom demonstrating how the trips associated with preparing a meatloaf could be reduced from 57 to 39. So there's much that is familiar here. But in the Hart Kitchen, we can also detect a tension emerging between this very deterministic idea of the one best way and a new, more flexible approach. Gilbreth had always advocated a high level of physical adaptability and movement in home spaces. She loved things on wheels. And the serving table on casters was really her signature feature. But you see she's also put an ironing board on wheels, and the task chair that we saw earlier was also on casters. In this, Gilbreth was in line with the particular tradition of the university-based home economists, rejecting both prefab fitted kitchens like the Frankfurt kitchen and streamlined commercial kitchens. This group defined the dream kitchen not as a standardized space, but as a tailored one, built around a specific homemaker's body, needs, and budget. As a matter of course, for instance, all home economists learned to measure the work curve, that is, minimum and maximum reach, to determine optimum heights and depths for each homemaker's cupboards, counters, and appliances. And as you can also see on this slide, they very much championed waist-high stoves and also fridges. The home economists' customized ethos reflected their core engagement with the cash-poor rural families who planned and built kitchens themselves, as well as their own fundamental preference for self-reliance and thrift. And this comes through in these 2 pages from the Hart Kitchen booklet. And you can see that everywhere self-reliance is stressed. You don't have to wait for a dream kitchen. Work with what you have. Unclutter your kitchen. Use homemade conveniences. So this is not at all about buying mass-produced goods. Perhaps even more significant, by the late 1940s, Gilbreth was also beginning to speak of flexibility less literally and more capaciously as freedom, creativity, and responsiveness. In short, as a liberating approach to housework. As she admonished readers in 1954, "You must keep the ability to change when it becomes necessary. This is being flexible." And again, flexibility means freedom from hidebound tradition. It means you can use your imagination and your creative ability to meet changing situations. For Gilbreth, adopting a flexible approach to homemaking was a way to increase personal satisfaction and to adapt to changing family cycles and personal circumstances, from pregnancy to illness to aging. It was also very much a way to rethink the traditional gendered division of labor. And you see there's this emphasis here on housework as a family affair. Being flexible meant having the freedom to redistribute domestic tasks across all members of the family according to inclination and aptitude rather than hidebound tradition, so that women no longer had to carry the domestic burden alone. As Gilbreth declared already in the 1930s, a shared industrial burden must mean a shared home burden. Gilbreth remained true to industrial engineering in the sense that she never doubted that people's happiness was tied up to their productivity. This is why, for her, the inability to work could only ever be regarded as a deficit and a loss. She described human waste as the greatest of all industrial waste, a common view expressed by efficiency experts, and the very thing that rightly disturbs critics today. We can't get away from the fact that the rehabilitation movement was wholly infused by this view. But the movement also embraced Gilbreth's belief that flexibility was the best remedy to the problem, advocating both the physical reorganization of the kitchen and home, and more radically, the redistribution of domestic labor. Strikingly, the booklet publicizing the Hart Kitchen mainly emphasized its preventative role rather than its remedial one. The heroine, Catherine Landis, is an ordinary homemaker with a weak heart, so not a visible disability. And readers were repeatedly told that the advice contained within would benefit everyone, disabled or not, a staple claim of rehabilitation literature and of the later universal design movement. Once the Hart Kitchen transferred to the Institute for Physical Medicine, however, more targeted work got underway involving very disabled housewives who relearned how to make and clear up meals with reportedly excellent results. One paraplegic relearned to do her own cooking, and according to an admiring article in the New York Times, often entertains as many as 4 dinner guests. Transmitted through exhibitions, demonstrations, this booklet, a film, and glowing media reports like the one just mentioned, the Hart Kitchen proved immensely influential and was soon being taken up as a model across the country. It also inspired an ambitious follow-up study, the Homemaking for the Handicapped project, at the University of Connecticut, another one of these land-grant universities, which ran from 1955 until 1960 and was co-sponsored by the U.S. Vocational Rehabilitation Administration. Gilbreth, by now a patron saint in this field, served as chief consultant. As before, this study was multidisciplinary, bringing together public health workers and doctors with industrial designers, architects, engineers, and home economists, highlighting the key role design was being given in these rehabilitation projects. It's also noteworthy that the research team visited other rehabilitation centers around the world. Apparently, they visited over 200 centers here in the UK, in Europe, Scandinavia, India, and Pakistan. And as we have a full list of all of these organizations, I think a fascinating future project would be to map out this network and try to really flesh out and understand all of these international influences. Again, the new program did not radically depart from the Hart Kitchen's methods and principles, but it now had a crisper and starker message. Citing the fact that nearly 5 million homemakers had disabilities of various sorts, it stated, "When a housewife is unable to perform her duties, an economic benefit to the nation is lost. Far worse, the family will suffer or even disintegrate." Flexibility, adaptability, and experimentation were presented as the surest tools for getting homemakers back to work. Tellingly, however, researchers in this study stopped speaking of the one best way and replaced it with another one of Gilbreth's sayings, "Where there's a will, there's a way." There were good reasons for this shift. Namely, rehabilitation work made it impossible to sustain the idea of the one best way, because the modernist ideal of a universal or standard user no longer held. In these projects, researchers were engaged with a full spectrum of users of extremely varied abilities, precisely those users who were usually excluded from anthropometric calculations. And I'd like to introduce you to Joe and Josephine, who were average figures representing the 50th percentile in size. And these standard figures were very typically used in industrial design and architecture. Faced with the reality that, as Rusk himself declared, solutions cannot be standardized, rehabilitationists began to use home engineering techniques mainly to guide adaptation processes rather than seeking the one best way. In working out what elements of a task, tool, or space needed changing, disabled homemakers were taught the questioning approach in order to analyze the component parts of an operation and then work out how to do it according to a few set principles and their own preferences and abilities. And I'm not sure how clearly you can read these slides, but just to give you a very quick sample of the questioning approach. What is the job to be done? Why should the job be done? Is it necessary? Where should it be done? When should it be done? Who should do the job? How should it be done? And so on. The resulting workspaces were not rule-free. Everything in them still had a place, and I think that's quite important to emphasize. But their improvised qualities now came to the fore. The book, which presented the program's findings to the public, Homemaking for the Handicapped of 1966, featured countless examples of elements that had been adapted to suit individual users. Wheelchair-bound users were shown comfortably performing domestic jobs in height-adjusted workspaces. Disabled homemakers were shown carrying out tasks with homemade assistive devices, from reach extenders, such as the one that you see here, to flat-bottomed mixing bowls, which could be secured to tabletops and then used one-handed. You also see that a normal household sponge has been used to fix a potato in place so that it can be peeled one-handed. And we also see a grater that's been designed to be used also one-handed. Parents of both sexes with prosthetic limbs were shown performing everyday childcare activities. And some were even shown creatively misusing standard domestic elements, such as this photo of a one-armed woman using a regular hinged door to open a bottle cap. These spaces flaunted their workshop aesthetic. Perforated masonite, pegboard, allowing implements to be hung at various heights, featured prominently. These spaces and tools, again, were unlike their streamlined commercial counterparts, reflecting both the paucity of mass-market products for the disabled in this period and the home economist's own preference for adaptability and self-reliance. Although not included in this particular book, it was common for manuals for the disabled to provide detailed instructions for how to make assistive devices at home, assuming readers had a decent level of carpentry and making skills. Aesthetic appeal was not the aim of these designs, which could be quite roughly made. Rather, the message was that this inventive approach to domesticity would enable disabled homemakers to perform the work upon which their families and communities supposedly depended. It was also understood to bring satisfaction and even joy to the user. As one commentator put it, to the designer, these solutions lack design. But we should not overlook the satisfaction of the designer user who envisions a solution to his own problem and sees it built, and the day-to-day pleasures that come with independent acts. Despite this strong emphasis on independence, there was also a long chapter devoted to pedagogical techniques for instilling cooperative behavior in children so that they could learn to assist their disabled parents in the home. This was a subject that was very near and dear to Gilbreth's heart, given her cooperative vision of domestic labor. It also highlighted that disabled homemakers could be competent caretakers, yet still themselves require care from their dependents. These studies are very powerful, but we should, of course, resist the tendency to idealize them or to treat them as what the disability scholar Joss Boyce calls inspiration porn. Disability scholars in particular have noted that many aspects of the early rehabilitationist projects are extremely problematic. In her powerful recent history of disability in America, Building Access, Amy Hamry attacks the rehabilitationist emphasis on productivity as a default condition of citizenship. This is best encapsulated by Gilbreth's mantra, where there's a will, there's a way, which comes dangerously close to suggesting that overcoming the effects of disability is purely a matter of individual initiative. So any failure to adjust is a failure of will, never a failure of the existing models and spaces of public and private life. Indeed, it's undeniable that all of these studies constantly reinstated the ideal of the nuclear family and the single family home. And even if much of this design research originated with low-income rural families, as it developed over time, it became more explicitly focused on the predominantly white, middle-class suburban home. We see this in a later Cardiac Kitchen, one from Madison, Wisconsin in 1952, which looks essentially like any other streamlined kitchen then on the market, apart from a few telltale signs. We have the waist-high oven, and we also have the burners arranged horizontally, and this was done to prevent excessive reaching. And when the Institute of Physical Medicine opened its demonstration house in 1960, the functional home for easier living, it was consciously typical looking, in Rusk's words, right down to this large green lawn, which raises the question, who exactly was meant to do all of this yard work? Rehabilitationists never seriously explored cooperative alternatives that required less work and maintenance because they assumed that outward conformity and normalcy was the goal of disabled people. To this end, they sought to adapt conventional spaces and routines with a heavy emphasis on assistive devices. But no matter how well prosthetic devices and prosthetic spaces functioned, they can only ever go so far. They can never substitute for the human exchanges that remain fundamental to care. The privileging of independence, the disability scholar David Serlin warns, should not stigmatize reciprocity, caring, and cooperation. A warning that someone like Gilbreth, with her interest in preparing children to actively take on household duties, would most probably have endorsed. For myself, I admit I have not lost my ambivalence about home economics. Sometimes it feels as if the exhaustive studies to improve things like meatloaf making come straight out of some Foucauldian biopolitical parody. You couldn't make them up. And it's no wonder later feminists broke away from these techniques, none more brilliantly than the artist Martha Rossler in Semiotics of the Kitchen, or slightly later, the architect Liz Diller in her Instructions for Dissident Ironing. Yet I hope I've made a case for regarding Gilbreth's ideas as being more than the sum of her methods. There's an obvious and unresolved tension between her early vision of the highly choreographed, efficient homemaker and her later portrayal of the flexible, creative one. Being flexible in a disabled home for Gilbreth did not just mean relearning to do the same domestic tasks. It involved reassessing the traditional gender division of labor, sharing out certain tasks amongst family members, and electing not to do others at all. Gilbreth often decried unrealistically high standards in housekeeping. She refused to see any point in ironing sheets. And many of the ideas she articulated, especially that husbands needed to share the home burden, would be taken up by feminists in some form in the 1960s and 70s. More than recuperating Gilbreth or home economists, however, what sustains my interest in these projects is what happens when we bring them into dialogue with mainstream architectural histories, which, as mentioned at the start of this talk, almost uniformly track the turn to flexible domesticity back to the European avant-garde, to emigres like Walter Gropius, or to the case study program encapsulated by the work of the Eameses, and their own case study house is paradigmatic. Yet the innovations of university-based home economists also obviously influenced mainstream domestic design of this period. Their influence is evident in many things, from the fashion for waist-high ovens and fridges in the 1950s. These became popular around the middle of the 1950s. And the design and layout of celebrity kitchens like Julia Child's, and it's pictured here. Child joyously used pegboard in her own kitchen, which is now preserved at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, and often wielded homemade devices, such as a rolling pin made from a broom handle. You can see this if you watch reruns of her show on YouTube. Through their high-profile and well-publicized projects, the home economists were also influential in terms of promoting the flexible domestic environment more generally as a way of adapting the home for a changing world, a bold form of future-proofing. At its most affirmative, they presented the flexible home as a site of creativity and invention for users. This vision of domestic space was not necessarily at odds with that found in the Eames house, which also treated domestic architecture as a backdrop for dynamic living over time. And as an aside, the Eameses also favored functional or rational kitchens. Even if we acknowledge overlaps, however, we should also recognize that the version of flexibility promoted by rehabilitationists emerged from distinct concerns, namely a concern for female domestic labor, disabled, and aging bodies, and a different design tradition, the functional design tradition of university-based home economists and home engineers like Gilbreth, who were not promoting a curated art of living, but were adapting environments and tools to suit user needs. In short, to acknowledge the influence of rehabilitationists is to take a concern for gender, disability, and user-centeredness from the margins and place it at the heart of design research in this period. While it's too much to claim that this design tradition was politically radical, I would suggest that it's had some radical effects. Ultimately, its greatest contribution has been to argue for the need to accommodate what we today call non-conforming bodies, and to assert that it's these bodies that should set design standards, rather than the able-bodied norm, which implicitly underpins much modern design, even today. Indeed, the call to accommodate non-standard bodies and the claim that this would benefit all users, regardless of ability, would eventually lay the ground for the universal design movement that emerged in the 1970s and would open the door to later exciting and, yes, truly inspiring domestic adaptations. So, thank you.